Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from Just Rusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about, well, you'll see, but checks on abuses of power. This might be the first Parley idea I've had, Just Rusty begins, that I think it would be absolutely okay to decline. With the increase in high-profile political assassinations in the US, I've been asking myself, is this the Second Amendment working as intended? As someone who's very anti-gun ownership, I live in the UK where we have way less guns, and I still get unsettled that some people I know who are farmers own hunting rifles or shotguns. They don't even have access to automatic weapons, and it makes me uncomfortable. I have always felt like the argument that the Second Amendment is important to resist government tyranny was very weak in the face of the overwhelming strength of the US military. However, if widespread gun ownership means the individuals making policies fear assassination if they abuse their power, is this successful use of the right to bear arms as checks and balances? To be clear, I'm less interested in whether this kind of direct action is right or ethical, like murdering people doesn't have to be good for this discussion to fire, just whether it is achieving the goals of the Second Amendment on a broad scope. Okay, cool. I'm happy you asked this question because this is the type of thing that, oh, you don't have to do this. You can just ask Parley about whatever you want, but I think it's cool when sometimes you folks use Parley as a place to ask questions that you basically just aren't allowed to ask most other places online. You know, most Twitch chats or whatever simply don't allow political topics. And they don't allow political topics because if you are a group of people that aren't united by some kind of analytical or ideological backbone, people are going to get heated about something with no real structure for how to work through it. We, however, are a community of people that insist on discussing. That's why we're here, and so we have some mechanism by which to kind of work this out. In some ways, it's more civil than being in an actual political debate, if you've had the misfortune of watching those recently. So I think this is a good thing to ask in this space. I'm just going to ask before we start that you treat me gently with this subject. I'm going to try to be open-minded and just discuss for the sake of us all gaining potential perspective or chewing on the thought nuggets that are bouncing around in our brain. I don't hate anybody or want to step on anyone's toes unless we can get to the point where we agree that it is better to do so. If you want your guns, I don't want to take them away unless I actually change your mind, even if it makes me uncomfortable, because I don't believe you won't just get them back otherwise. I don't think that it is practical for people to have a lot of guns. I'm sort of in the same position as Just Rusty. I wouldn't say I'm afraid is the wrong word of them having guns, but I don't think it's a good thing that people are running around with guns everywhere. So that implies that I don't think it's effective. That is, like, there are some benefits to people having guns, none of which are coming to my mind at this moment, but I'm sure I'm just kidding, they're in my notes. But there are obviously not zero benefits to people being allowed to have firearms. Can we agree about that? You don't have to, actually, but I think that's true. There are some, massively outweighed by the detriments, benefits to people running around with a lot of firearms. So are those benefits enough to make it, worth people having them everywhere? That is not the topic of this parlay. The topic of this parlay is it effectively providing a sort of counterweight to an abuse of political power? Just as an aside, before we continue, I also want to say that I'm not an expert on these subjects, and so we won't be getting into, is that what the Second Amendment is? You know what I mean? I don't know. Like, I'm not I kind of know, obviously, right? Like, I know what the Second Amendment is, but I'm not a lawyer. Like, strictly speaking, I don't know. I would guess no, but I'm please don't sue me. I will just note, obviously, that the Second Amendment was made outside the context of the weapons we now have. I do actually think that's worth talking about for a minute. So, for example, I'm very interested in early firearms from like a writing or like storytelling or game mechanic perspective, because early firearms are more balanced. That's right. That's what you were all thinking. You got a big musket, and yeah, it fires a death ball, but it's like smooth bore, and so the aim is bad, and you have to friggin' do the hokey pokey to reload it. And it's an assault rifle. This is not, right? So there's an element in which if you're telling people they have the right to bear arms, and the thing that they have the right to bear is a pole arm that can fire a death ball once per minute, that is a roguelike power up. That is not an AK-47, And so those are not the same thing. And so I hope we can agree that at least the idea that like it's an American value that you are allowed to have guns. Okay, but like when that was established, that didn't really have anything to do with the things we have now. They're arguably not even really the same actual device. There's a part of me that wants to argue that it might seem a little pedantic, but I feel like it still means something, that like the things we're referring to are not really guns in the same way that those things were guns. You know what I mean? That it's more effective to call a musket something like a cannon. It's like a weird cannon, whereas the things we have are something else. And what you want to call guns is whatever. But to say that these are legal because those were legal, I don't think that's a very good argument. But again, that's kind of not what this parlay is about. I sort of want to talk about that if you can't tell, but it's not what this parlay is about. Yeah, by the way, people that are into guns, yeah, they had like pepper box pistols, and you can have a weapon with multiple shots. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's not like you were running around with something that is like the war crime machine. Instead, it was more like you had a spear that is a bit better at the war. While I personally don't think this changes the argument for guns generally that much, it still has some effect on the discussion, and I feel like it's worth noting. But again, probably most people have thought of that without me saying it. So let's describe what we're working with here. This obviously requires a lot of unpacking, but we're trying to do that. So again, you don't have to agree that killing people you don't like is good. For people having guns, the reality is people have a ton of guns in the United States. Does that have a successful here means like people in power abuse their power less because they are thinking that like people will shoot them if they dislike them? There's kind of two parts here. You have to establish that people in power are afraid of people shooting them, which we'll talk about that. I think we'll talk about that first. And then you need to establish that that causes them to make less like politically something decisions. And then like that the people with the guns don't want them to make. You can see that that's actually a slightly complicated claim. So we'll get to that later. I would say my thesis going into this discussion is no, it's not effective. But I don't think there's no effect. I think that it's not effective for different reasons than I would think. And the first one, let's get into that first point. Are the people in power afraid of people like assassinating them because they have guns? On some level, you can say, yeah, probably. I don't know. On a basic level, it seems sort of silly to say no. But I want to really dig into this point, though. Okay, but are they really behaving extremely differently because of the threat of gun violence? Again, you could use lots of different forms of data to try to prove this, and an expert in this position would probably do that. I think you could do some productive things with that, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not. You didn't ask an expert, you asked me. I think fairly intuitively that policy I'm in my 30s. So policy since I was alive enough that I noticed the policy there. There's more gun violence, but there's more extreme political measures being passed. So I would say on a basic level, that makes me want to say, well, no, it doesn't seem at all like, if anything, it seems like the constituents of the people in power having tons of guns makes them more willing to do something that is an abuse of their power. Because that's the problem with this, right? We're going to get into it later with this second point more. But it's not, if you think of people in control of the US government in whatever way you want to think of that, the many branches of the US government. In different parts of the US government, some person is at an advantageous position. And there are people that disagree with their position that have guns. But there are also a lot of people who agree with their position that have guns. Does this equal out to people really being more scared? If people are surrounded by guns all the time, do they retain the fear? Like, for a long period of time, if they see people carrying all over the place every day, do they stay afraid of that in the same way, or does that fear diminish over time? I know that one's kind of a leading question. And finally, do people who already know that they are massively taking the piss out of the political system still worry that people will dislike them? And again, that's not the same thing as saying, but are they afraid of being shot and killed? Like, okay. But, and I also think a final thing is that there's a big difference between someone who wants to assassinate you getting access to a firearm and like Joe constituent over there having access to a firearm. You know what I mean? I feel like it has, rather than that it isn't effective, I feel like I'm leaning more in the direction of there is might be surprisingly just kind of no effect, rather than it being like good or bad for abuses of political power. And I would say that if there's about no effect, then obviously it's bad because having guns around is risky. I'm sure even many people who are proponents of gun ownership rights would agree there are some problems with having guns everywhere. There's not zero risk if there's a firearm like around you, right? Of course. That's why you want it, because it is dangerous, right? If you think it's effective, then you agree that there is some risk for it being around. And you just think that that risk is outweighed by the benefits. Okay, but I disagree, but that's not a nonsense argument. You just consider some things worth more than other things that I consider worth more. Okay. You know, if you were to argue, and some people listening to this probably are, unfortunately, I'm not sure I could do much for you, that there are no detriments to having a ton of guns around, that is a pretty shallow argument. But we could have a discussion where I will disagree with you, but we could have a discussion if people were to argue that just the benefits outweigh the detriments. I think all I have to say is that the benefits politically, I don't really see it. I'm not sure that I feel like it's actually that negative. That might seem like a weird argument. I don't think it's good for people to be running around with guns, but is most of the negative part of that political? Maybe not directly. I think the main problem is just constituents of a candidate feeling empowered and then using their gun ownership to enforce their beliefs personally, like not on political figures. And that's like just the gun violence problem. So if the specific question of this parlay is, the part of the answer we're giving here is, do people in power feel afraid in a way that has an effect of more people running around with guns? I would say I don't see it personally. Not a huge amount. No, I don't think so. Couple of caveats that are maybe sort of obvious. So the first one is, I'm not a history buff. If you look through the history of the United States and you counted like publicized at the time assassinations, not declassified assassination attempts, but publicized at the time assassination attempts, I don't know, but you might find that there have been more lately. And so there's politicians on both sides of the U.S. Unfortunate dichotomy of politics that people don't like. And there may have been more, let's just say there was more publicized assassination attempts recently. Doesn't that mean that the population likes the policies less and responds with more assassination attempts? Therefore, the mechanism kind of vaguely works. No, remember, for this to be true, we also have to agree that the politicians are actually making policies that are less of an abuse of their power, which I don't think it's clear that they are. Not just that people who own guns do use them in a way that vaguely correlates with them being unsatisfied with the current government, right? That's relevant, but that's not all that you need for this to be working. Nevertheless, I could say, okay, so compared to what I expected, the Second Amendment is an absolutely terrible, basically doesn't even exist as a control for abuse of power in government. Yeah, surprisingly, at least as far as the people with the guns expressing their displeasure, actually, no, that does seem to vaguely correlate with. I'm just not sure it's effective at actually making things better, but does that expression correlate with people being unsatisfied with their government? Maybe. Surprisingly, a little, maybe. Yeah, okay, I don't know. Again, maybe not. You would want to look at the data. But that could be the main thing I'm trying to establish here is that could be true, and that doesn't mean that it's effective to use guns to enforce your political opinion on its own. It doesn't mean that. We'll get to that in the second part. Okay, second caveat, confirmation bias. Maybe obvious. We don't know all of the assassination attempts. Maybe there have been like hilariously more, and therefore there's a lot of pressure that you probably would feel in a position of power right now that we don't have any reason to know from the public perspective. I mean, obviously, I have no insider information, so who knows, right? I don't think it's that weird to wonder if maybe there have like been things we haven't heard about happening in the government, almost certainly, right? And so do those things change this discussion? Maybe, maybe, I don't know. I will just say that having everybody run around with a camera phone has always made it like sort of harder for in the modern age for things to happen. A really good example of this I like are UFO sightings. It's funny how the number of times that has come up in recent history and felt like credible to people has, at least from my perception, fallen off ever since everyone started running around carrying a high quality camera phone, suggesting that the reasons that things seemed like a UFO sighting were fairly clearly mostly just because it was unclear what the person was seeing. And if you just give everybody a high fidelity camera, it becomes clear rather quickly that there aren't at least a significant amount of unidentified flying objects. That doesn't mean there aren't any. There could be aliens around, but I think it is as clear as it has always been that there isn't like an amazing reason to think that's the case currently. And that's more clear if we have good camera phones. It seems kind of harder for a huge amount of assassination attempts to happen currently than it would have been in the past, and for them not to have been like, for them to be public. So you can assume that there probably isn't like 100 times more than before, yet we somehow know about none of them. Like that seems kind of unrealistic, right? But there could still be significantly more and we don't know, or significantly less, but we know about all of them now. You know what I mean? So this could mean either thing. It is absolutely possible, without further data or insider information, that even if it seems like the publicly available information about assassination attempts on politicians in the US that has gone up, it's possible it has actually gone down, but it's just that all of them are publicized now, and a lot of them were covered up before. Most of them are publicized now. It's also possible that there are way more, and we have found more of them get publicized, but even more of them have been covered up. That is possible, sure. I feel like that. Maybe this is an obvious point, but I feel like it matters a lot. It suggests that we have very little ability to know this. That is basically the thing I'm doing with this section. I don't think that you really see it, and I tried to make one of my main arguments here is that people on from every side of the political spectrum have access to firearms in the United States. And I think you can see that emboldens constituents to enforce their own beliefs, but does that actually go on to dampen the politicians' behavior? I'm not sure I totally see the like game theory behavior that would lead to that. Okay, moving on to second thing. Let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that we do agree that people are consistently expressing their displeasure toward the politics in the United States using firearms. There is some maybe argument to be made that that is happening. Again, we don't really know without more data, but let's just, for the sake of discussion, assume that that is kind of true. I'll be honest with you, it does seem a little true to me. Again, we just talked about, we don't really have a way to know this, but it does seem to me like there have been slightly more assassination attempts on political figures, and people do seem less pleased with their politics. Again, this is in a pretty meaningless human way, but I'll just tell you that has been my experience. Sure, I don't think that really means much, but you asked, so yeah, I don't know. It does kind of seem like that to me. I've lived around the part of the United States I've lived in for most of my life. I lived here as a kid, and then I was away for a while, but I moved back to not the same place, but like the general state, the general area. And this is much more, I guess, political than it's been in the past. You can see political tensions and people grouping together in places where they just didn't before. I see more of a noticeable effect of people disagreeing about politics than I did when I was here in the past. Now, to be clear, while this is just an n equals 1 pretty meaningless amount of data sample size, I mean, there is some reason why that means something. For example, this is the place I live right now. A friend of mine went to college here, and I did go to an apple orchard in the area. Since moving back to this area, I went to the same apple orchard. And so that same route, you can see how things have changed over time. And I remember that the politics of that area were not the same, or there wasn't anything noticeable, basically. I remember specifically looking for that because it was something in my past. Anyway, I was in the area and I wanted to know what the sort of situation was in this place where my friend went to college, because they told me a story about a rally and I wanted to know more about it. And I remember looking for like, okay, so people live here where statistically, I don't know, do you do this? You look at your state's political spread and say, okay, maybe this state is a bit of a swing state. So it's like close to 45-55, Democrats, Republicans, or whatever. But then there are some states where it's kind of weird that this is the extreme end, but like where it's like 33 to 66% Republicans to Democrats. So even if you feel like, oh, that means there's tons of Democrats everywhere, well, there are a lot of Republicans. So where are they? Or where are all the Democrats? I think that's a helpful thing to think about. If I vote Democratic, there are 1/3 of people here who don't say they don't want the thing I voted for. So where are they? Like, I care still about the other people in this space. I think that it's okay for people to want it to be different. I just wish we could kind of find a better compromise than just sort of one side takes all. But this isn't an American voting system video. Again, you can see that I might be interested for it to be one, but unfortunately. So what we're trying to establish here, blah, 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 is just that let's say that you, like me, have felt like there are more political assassinations. Understanding that this doesn't really mean that much, because we don't know if that's just the ones that have been publicized, or, it's very easy to fall prey to a confirmation bias, or like the sample size is bad here. But just acknowledging that, let's just say for the sake of argument that that was true. So does that result in the people in power abusing their power less? What is an effective way to answer this question? Because my worry is that if I were to say that it doesn't cause them to abuse their power less, then people who agree with the current administration will just argue that that like isn't an abuse of power or something. I feel like can we agree somehow that the things that are being done in the US government over the past few years are extreme in a sort of absolute sense, whether or not you like agree with them being done? Could that maybe be a reasonable avenue? Again, I imagine a majority of the audience listening, you're just easily convinced of this part. And so I'm trying to find a way to describe it where someone who doesn't completely agree with me would be able to see, okay, well, there just objectively has been like literally just more raw amount of policy passed. That might not be true, but the current administration has admitted that their strategy is a kind of blitz. Just run through a bunch of policies really quick. The news won't be able to cover it all. And that does seem like it's been true. And so could we at least agree that even if you think that like shouldn't be extreme or whatever, there has just literally been a lot more policy. And so if you were afraid of gun violence and being assassinated for doing things that people didn't like in the country that you're in power in, would you blitz out 1 million policies? Or would you like be cautious in any way at all? I would argue you would be cautious in some way at all, right? And so it seems to me like just the raw amount of stuff happening politically means that it is not an effective check on an abuse of power. In fact, it seems like if abuse of power just means doing more with your power, which is a little reductive, it is, but if we've simplified it that way to try to get everyone to be able to agree that there's at least something statistically abnormal happening in politics currently, I feel weird trying to make the argument in this subtle way. Like, surely that's easy to agree with, but I don't know. Then no, like that definitely isn't working. You know, they're not at all. If anything, it seems like it is encouraging abuse of power. And in a way, I mean, let me paint you a picture. You are a person in power in the US government. I don't agree with your policies and am of questionable moral and ethical mind, and I'm running around with a firearm, and I don't like you. Let's just keep it that way, please. I'm trying really hard for this video to like somehow not get me in trouble as a human being. I just want to discuss this topic that somebody is interested in discussing. You might be worried that I will remove you from power. You could react to this by like being careful not to step on my toes or something. Or you could react to this by like just doing all the stuff you want to do really fast and hoping for the best. And there is some argument for doing the second thing, right? Like if you are scared in the dark, being hunted by a serial killer, and you need to get something done, you should probably just hurry up. It could take a lot for you to just pack it all in, you know? What are you going to do? Not do further things that offend the person that's trying to murder you and then like hope that they forget about the things you did before? You see what I mean? It just doesn't really make sense. From a cost benefit analysis, you kind of already, you had the cost imposed upon you. Just by being a politician, everybody hates you. And then the benefit is like, well, you might as well just do whatever you want now because the maximum threat has already, you know, been obtained. So I don't think it makes any sense on even a basic level because the threat is kind of there, not particularly related to the actions the person is doing from their perspective, I would expect. Again, the people that would be threatening violence probably don't see it this way. They would probably say, no, like I'm only trying to enforce my rights, and if they're stepped on, that's when I'll do something. But I don't see any reason why people who are afraid that you're going to kill them would believe you. I wouldn't. I don't at all trust that, oh, you'll only use that concealed carry when there's a real danger. I'm sure you have a philosophy student's level of experience with deciding when there is an appropriate level of danger. I'm sure you do. And so I feel very safe with that, is what I have never, ever once thought. And so I think it's the same thing, right? I don't see why you as a politician would be, it doesn't actually make that much sense to be more afraid, is basically what I'm saying. Because there isn't any reason to believe that these things are a coherent mechanism that enforces itself. If the moment you sign an executive order that infringes on someone's personal right to their body, you get shot in the foot, like instantaneously, you would stop doing that. But that doesn't happen. Like, that's not what's happening at all, obviously. And so I think there's also a lot of room for people, maybe not the most empathetic toward humanity people in the world, some of the people in power, to just say they don't think that that is justified, or they don't really connect it to an action that they did. Yes, the like Pavlovian training thing totally works. You get negative feedback and you as a human will respond in a surprisingly mechanical way, even if you were a super paranoid overthinker like me. You can still absolutely associate like a threat or a reward with a certain kind of action or whatever without understanding it. But the association needs to be very local. That is, it has to happen quite directly. Just the vague threat of something, and the threat is from like everyone everywhere at all times, it does not at all work to get people to, just on a basic level, people don't internalize that as being related to this other thing. Even if I say to you, oh, the reason people are so keen on having guns like is because they want to enforce their political situation. So here, about 2/3 of the way through the parlay, I would say no. Actually, I feel a bit stronger than I did at the start of the video. I don't think there's any reason to believe that this is even remotely effective. I don't think that this is why most people care about the Second Amendment. But if it is, no, I don't see any reason to believe it's effective. And we talked about this before, but if you're saying that you think it's effective because you can literally kill the people in power you don't like, well, that's not going to lead to a good society either. So even if you would argue, well, that has to be effective because then they're not there. First of all, I think you underestimate how much the people in power just do the things that they're forced to by the environment around them and are not like really individuals in the same way. It's not like their personal opinion is that we simply must, I don't know, like pass or not pass gun control. Let's do a little thought experiment. So you're in power currently. And I would say that the current United States government is a majority in control of people who are pro-gun ownership. That's how it seems to me. And so let's say that as one of those people, you listen to this parlay. Hi there. Maybe consider some other points of view now and again. And so you think, well, I'm going to pass laws to make gun ownership illegal. I don't know, let's do something kind of corrupt, like just where I live, so that I don't have to be as afraid of, getting shot because I did something people don't like. Okay, let's say that you did this. Well, you can't, because if you do, then you'll be instantly voted out of your position because the people around you want you to keep voting for that or keep, enforcing that so that your constituents still vote for them. And then they'll still vote for you, something to this effect. Therefore, not super directly, but you fairly directly can't change your mind about that position. It doesn't really matter whether you personally like it or not. It isn't really healthy, in my humble opinion, to think of politicians as having personal values. It doesn't really matter in terms of game theory. They have the values of the block surrounding them, not their own personal values. And it's weird to act like, oh, I like this candidate for president personally. Like, no, you don't know them. / publicly, they sort of don't exist. They represent a movement or policy. It's not you like this individual. That's kind of weird to me and has sort of freaked me out in recent years that people are like, oh, I'm like ready to vote for this human being. Like, that's not how our political system works, even a little. So no, that doesn't matter. On some local levels, okay, maybe. But in the US government, the stuff we're talking about in this video, no, like it doesn't matter that much what those individual people's views are, in my opinion. It doesn't not matter at all. If they were diametrically opposed to doing these things, they probably wouldn't do them, sure. But it's like they can't care that much, or you wouldn't want to be in this position because you're constantly getting shunted around by other motivations and kind of playing the game of politics. So if you were a person who very specifically wanted the specific things you want to do done exactingly, you simply wouldn't be in politics, or that would be beaten out of you by being in politics. So I don't think it's productive to act like, oh, they'll just personally change their mind and that matters. Like I don't think they will, and it doesn't really. I don't think. But there's kind of an additional point I wanted to play into here, which, yeah, is like, are they going to be scared of this? It's kind of an extension of the point from before about if everybody hates you so much, I believe that one of the big problems with current politics in the United States, and really a lot of places, if you couldn't tell from this discussion, is that it's very impersonal, very impersonal. I think that almost all human beings won't do something that will be really bad for their fellow human beings if they see that it is bad. And therefore, not the way we should need to do it. You should just be willing to think about things and see reason and do things for good, reasoned reasons that you can explain to other people, and then you can do good things for people without having to personally know them. That's the good way to do it, but the feasible way to do it is to force people to see the consequences of their decisions. And I believe if you did this, 90% of political problems would work themselves out. Most people wouldn't agree to vote for a lot of the things they vote for if they could see the consequence of that thing. Now, it's not really that simple. I don't know, you could do like connect all human brains into a psychic thought weave. And then I guess that would make most people unable to do basically anything. But sure, I guess. If you were to, let's say you pass a law that gives people more freedom getting automatic weapons, and then you experience the perspective of a school shooting. It seems like you would then agree not to let people have automatic weapons, right? But, and unfortunately, I think this is surprisingly reasonable of a concern. You would be concerned that you are being presented a cherry-picked example. And what exactly is the objective way to give people perspective, right? It's not easy. What has, I don't know about worked, but like been done and sort of been fine in the past is for people who are in charge of a group of people to just be living in the same exact location as those people. And so if something affects the group, it affects them, and they can make a, relatively down to earth decision about whether they think this is good. I'm not sure if I agree that really worked that well in the past historically, but I'm not that much of a history expert. So I don't know. I took some history classes and I kind of don't think that worked that well, but I don't know. I'm not that qualified to say that. Just to say that I think that a huge amount of the problem is that it's not a very personal experience. You kind of just do the political game. Most people do most things they do because the people around them want them to do it. It is very, very difficult morally to live your life constantly doing things that everybody around you tells you not to do. That's very, very difficult for most human beings. And even if the person has like no emotions, I know some people right now are saying, oh, but lots of the current US political spectrum just doesn't have any human empathy. Like, I'm sure that more of them do than you would think. And it's just that they're surrounded with people that tell them that what they're doing is good, regardless of how bad it is. But certainly, I'm sure some people in politics don't really have much of a sense of human empathy. Sure. Yes, I'm sure that's somewhat true. And I don't think that matters that much. Because what are they going to be motivated by? I mean, personal gain or like things that just seem easier in the moment, right? And a lot of the time, a really easy way to do bad things is to do easy things. So I don't think it matters that much if people aren't like cripplingly involved in the people around them. I think that it's still quite feasible, very reasonable to expect that they will do people pleaser-y like things, even though under the surface they're not actually doing it to like please other people, but they will behave basically the same way though. And to not do this, you need to invent all of your human values from the ground up and be able to say, yeah, everyone else in the entire world is wrong, and here is my explanation of why I think that. I don't want them to not be able to choose differently. I think this about many topics. Relationships, for example. Basically, everyone is doing it completely wrong. And you need to reinvent how you think about human connection from the ground up to have actually healthy relationships. And I have done that. And if you would like to spend a few hours talking about that, I would be glad to enumerate such a value. But I don't think most of you want to hear that as part of this discussion. It has fully nothing to do with what we're talking about. Except to make the point that being a person who just does things because they are good, like in a platonic meditation plane, is completely unrealistic for running like a country anytime soon. You might be able to get humanity to a place where like at some point in the far sci-fi ass future, people could behave that way, but not like anytime soon that in a way that matters. So I sort of feel like the response to that, for me, is to say, maybe in politics, we should just stop pretending as much that people have reasons at all for why they're doing the thing they're doing, and ask for them, sure, but be more realistic and say, okay, if you're going to tell people that they like this change is imposed on their life, you need to be forced to experience it so that you can decide if that is really worth what you think the benefits are. If you think something about like women's abortion rights or gun control or immigration, you should have to experience the effects of that firsthand and then decide, like, okay, so do you still think that it's a good idea? And that's not perfect, but I think that more than you would expect, perhaps some of you might be cynical enough to think that won't do anything. Some people would see that and go, yeah, I can't really conscionably agree with that if I can see like the on the ground consequences of doing it one way or another. And the problem is it's just kind of hard to describe what those on the ground consequences are. Obviously, the topic hanging over this entire discussion of whether it's like successful use of the right to bear arms as checks and balances for power in the US political scene is that the consequences hilariously massively outweigh any benefit you would argue is there. And the important thing is, I don't see any benefit, really. So even if you argue that there are not very many drawbacks, it doesn't seem like it works at all. So no, I don't really see it. I don't know. I don't ever think this is a great... I'm going to talk about a meta thing for a few minutes and then finish up. It's not a great position. Because people don't mostly make decisions based on strict reasoning, it's like a back and forth in discussion. It is very effective if you want to disarm a subject to be able to describe the benefits and the drawbacks. If you want to convince people that it is better to choose differently than they currently do, it's weird, but I believe that it is advantageous for there to be a legitimate point to choosing one way or the other. That there's something on both sides, and you can say, but I don't think that that is worth more than this thing, and here is my argument why. Can I show you the benefits of this other thing, while still acknowledging that the thing that you think is more valuable absolutely exists. I just don't think that when push comes to shove, I think I can show you that it's more beneficial. And my experience as a perversely fascinated human being who wants to change people's minds, even when I don't want to change people's minds, I don't know. It's like picking at a scab. Like, I just want to see this. I have many times in my life had these situations where I have had opportunity to potentially change someone's mind about something. And I'm the kind of person who records Parley all day. So I usually don't think that it's clear that you ought to do things differently. I'm just going to give you an oversimplified example. So my mom and I drink a lot of coffee together, and when we're hanging out. And for years, they've had a, what's the company called? Anyway, the Technivorm, the Mochamaster Technivorm, is that what it's called? Anyway, the Technivorm is a very famous coffee brewing machine. It's pretty simple. It's just like a cone and then a thing that boils water, and it doots the water over a little arm, and then that kind of dribbles and rains water onto the coffee bed, and it brews your coffee. Not very different than the design of like most automatic coffee brewers. And like most automatic coffee brewers, it's surprisingly effective, but also just way worse than something you could do trivially easily yourself. But it does some of the stuff for you, of course, right? And so to say that it's better to brew your coffee in the morning manually is already just like, well, no, it's clearly apples to oranges. However, you could say, well, just try both processes and then decide if you think one is better than the other. There aren't no benefits to the Techniform, but I think that if you saw the benefit in like the flavor of the coffee, which my mom cares about, if you brewed it yourself, the bed would be more even. We could get into why that would be, but that's not what this is about. You would be willing to pay the small inconvenience of having to do it manually. You understand what's happening here. It would not be very effective to argue that it is pointless to have the Technivorm, and that it's better in all ways to brew manually. It obviously isn't better in all ways. It isn't better in that it isn't automatic. It doesn't boil the water for you and then put it over the coffee. So it obviously isn't better in all ways. You often hear people online use rhetoric where they say, this is just completely better, there's no point to this other thing. And then if someone points out that there obviously is this other benefit to this other thing, the person who first said there's no point will say, oh, right, but that thing doesn't matter. And that's obviously a very ineffective argument, right? That thing is the only thing that seems to matter to the people that agree with using the Technivorm. So it doesn't really make any sense to discard it. And here's the key thing. I actually think it's a very useful, I don't know what to say, like fulcrum, I guess, for the discussion if you want to demonstrate the benefit of this other thing. It's helpful for there to be complex, not overly complex, but somewhat complex trade-offs to things, because it means you can just make a decision about which one you prefer. Whereas if you create a worldview where, like, according to reason and logic, there is legitimately no benefit to the Technivorm, I mean, people who have been using it as a habit, the habit itself is a reason to use it, right? So even if they didn't have that habit, there would truly somehow be genuinely no benefit to doing it the way they're doing. I mean, to them, it feels like there is a benefit. And it being something that is outside the realm of logic and reason means you can't really interact with it. I mean, you could just like imprison them and force them to brew coffee manually for months or something. But that's not very effective, right? What's helpful if you're going to discuss is to allow you and the person you're discussing with to be in the same place to say, you don't have to do this thing differently, but it's how my mom had asked me about this, but it's how I like to do it. And I do think it's more beneficial overall, but yeah, you know, it doesn't happen automatically. I just think that if you tried that, you might come to realize you don't care about that much, you know, and that you might like the benefit more. As with many things, it's that the detriment maybe isn't as bad as it seems, and the benefit is maybe bigger than it's being made out to be. And usually the margin for error is that people are thinking about like the extra work. Again, they're in the habit of doing it this way, and so it seems harder to not. For example, if I were to use a Technivorm, a Mocha Master Technivorm, to brew my coffee in the morning, I don't really brew my coffee in the morning, but if I did, I would initially have more trouble than brewing it manually. What? But it's less work. Okay, but I'm less used to the things you need to do. And also, I care more about some of its weaknesses. For example, it is going to taste worse, maybe just not that much worse most of the time. And I currently care about that more. So my habitual value, I guess, for the flavor of the coffee will make me more fixated on how well that's gone, you know. So I'll have to fuss with it to get it to taste good, maybe more than I would otherwise need to. Getting a bit too much into it, the key point is, if there can be a legitimate argument on both sides, even if they're not of a particularly comparable size, like in your opinion or whatever, I believe that this helps a lot to discuss things, because it means that you can turn the conversation into something that is just about weighing the benefits and drawbacks. That's not trivially easy for something like gun violence, where people's lives are in the balance, but I don't think that it's better than people just, the only reason that they think that it's good to vote for or against is literally just because they personally feel like it is. There's no actual contents to that reasoning, right? You can't really interact with it. You can't challenge it by saying, what about this human suffering? Or what about people's, I don't know, feeling of security or whatever people think is good about owning guns. You can't interact with it in any way. You see what I'm trying to say? In a way, if people are just afraid of guns, then someone saying like, oh, but I want a gun for home defense, like without unpacking the gun for home defense thing, which for a third time, I would enjoy doing a parlay on such a thing. Weapons for home defense, I guess, is what I'd want the parlay to be, and why I think guns are such a phenomenally terrible choice. Obviously terrible choice, but anyway. You can't just say, oh, well, I have a gun for home defense, it keeps me safe, if the person on the other end's argument is, but I'm afraid of guns. Like, the content of that argument is not ultimately reasoning. The guns can be scary. I'm not making fun of the person being afraid of guns, but ultimately the contents of that argument is emotional. We might be able to have a discussion where we get both people to be emotional rather than reasonable, and then we could try to compare. But you see what I'm trying to say. If we're going to have an actual discussion about these subjects, usually it's necessary to at least be working using the same criteria for discussion. If one person's criteria is emotional and another person's is rational, it's not that one of these is like better or whatever. You can have emotions, but they just don't really interact. Like, they don't plug in. I don't know. I think the ultimate problem with this subject is that I don't see basically any argument for gun ownership enforcing like checks and balances in political power. I don't see there as being a very weak argument. I see there as being literally zero or maybe even negative argument. That is, it might actually make things worse. And I see basically no evidence that it make things better in any way. And so that's kind of bad in the sense that it makes it very difficult to discuss. Like there's essentially no reason to do this, but that means we have to default to the reasons why people just want to own guns, which is way harder to tackle and unpack. So shit. Thanks for the parlay. I don't have an immersive outro for you. If you'd like to ask your own parlay questions, you can do so using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. You can ask whatever you want. I do want to say I appreciate, Just Rusty, that you said it would be okay for me to decline this one. I know you know from me doing parlay that I want to accept questions like this. And I will be sad if I ever have to say no to them. So you're welcome to do this. You're not like putting me out or being mean or something. I kind of want people to use this service vaguely this way. I will just say that I think you'll find that many political topics will boil down to this problem. If you really analyze them, the truth is the conversation about one side versus the other is not actually using the same rhetoric on both sides. And so you will find that there is actually some decent headway to be made, like let's say logically or emotionally, but that doesn't really plug into the complaint on the other side of the discussion, so it will end up feeling a bit flat or pointless. That's too bad. But I mean, I'm still happy to talk about it. I'm just saying you might find that a good number of topics will, at least to me, appear to be this way. And yeah, by all means, pick my brain about the other, like 4 other parlay topics I suggested. The relationship thing, or I was saying that thing about like home defense weapons. Anyway, you know, it's in the description if you want. Otherwise, see you next time. Looking forward to the next one.